Good afternoon and welcome to the last of our discussions for the Family Business Summit for 2021. It's been a great week already. We've had some fantastic insights from some fantastic people all around the world. And this afternoon is no exception. I am delighted to be joined by Ramia and Josh, who I will get to introduce themselves shortly. Ramia is a fellow interviewer, journalist, I guess, in terms of the family business field, Ramia. So I'm going to come to you first. Tell us a little bit about what you do and what you love about family businesses.
I like to start by saying I do not deserve the title of journalist at all. I'm a typical entrepreneur, self-made in everything I do, I guess. I would say the most defining thing about what I do is that I am actually part of a family business. I'm a second generation. I mostly work with my two sisters, Farida and Shireen, who I can never not mention because they're integral part of everything I do, really on the day-to-day basis. We run several businesses together. The one that is probably the most pertinent to this discussion is our content and marketing studio, under which we run Tharawat magazine, which is a family business magazine, which we started 13 years ago when I was fresh out of business school and innocent and wide-eyed and thought publishing was a great idea to get into. And Tharawat magazine today is fortunately still around, and we're happy to report many readers. Our editorial vision is really to bring content to business owners who want to make their companies last for generations. That's our purpose, really, as a magazine. And we've been very lucky to be allowed to interview hundreds of family businesses, covering over 70 countries of provenance already. And we have a podcast, a spin-off brand called Women in Family Business, which we very much encourage you to get into. Super content there as well. And I would say our whole existence is really revolves around being a family business, and also, a lot of the content we create for family businesses, and we're just very passionate about the topic. And you'd think that we, by means of having so much access to that kind of content, segue a lot of the typical family business challenges, but we are an absolute cliche and have exactly the same kinds of problems like all other family businesses do: succession, conflict, rivalries, etc. So we tick a lot of those boxes. So that's basically us. We run a nonprofit organization for family enterprises in the Middle East as well. I would say it's one of the premier networks across all Arab countries. So very busy across the board. I would say just a couple of entrepreneurial sisters trying to, have some fun and create some value here.
It's just really lovely to see you. So when you talk about family business, I guess it's a little bit like me, but you're infectious and your passion just shines through. So you clearly love what you do.
I do.
really looking forward to your insights this afternoon. Josh, can I get you to talk a little bit about what you do and how you've got to where you are today?
Sure, happy to. Paul, thanks as always for including me into this, into the great work that you're doing for family businesses. I'm a co-founder and partner of a firm called BanyanGlobal. We work with family enterprises around the world on the issues that Ramia was talking about, on succession and transition, managing conflict, developing the next generation, putting governance into place. We've been around for almost 10 years. It's actually easy for me to remember. Our firm is the same age as my twins. So in May, both Banyan and they will turn 10, which is always very exciting. I've been doing this work for about 15 years. Before that, I was a strategy consultant with Bain & Company, and then a spinoff of Bain called Bridgespan that works with large foundations and nonprofit organizations. In addition to my day job working with families, I teach at Columbia Business School. I teach a class called Family Business Management, which kind of covers the full range of all issues related to family businesses. And then another class called Managing Conflict in Family Business, which is, I think the title kind of describes it. That's kind of the reality of how do you...
Let's talk, Josh. Let's talk.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and the kind of the idea is that conflict is something that you actually can't avoid in a family, and you shouldn't try to avoid it. Avoiding it is actually just as destructive as allowing it to run rampant. And it's all about how do you manage it? How do you find that right place in the middle between too much and too little conflict? And then last, I do a bunch of writing on family business topics, mostly for Harvard Business Review. And my colleague Rob, who was on earlier this week, and I had a book come out earlier this year, which is all about how do you build a family business that can last for the long term.
Which coincidentally is why you're on the panel today, Josh, to be fair.
Oh.
But, so the theme for this afternoon is all about creating a sustainable business. And I kind of envisage now that we're on a sofa together in a big room with lots of people listening to us. And actually, I couldn't have two better people on the sofa with me this afternoon to talk about this topic. Let's start with just a general question in terms of sustainable family business. What do you think are the main factors involved in creating a sustainable family business going forward? Josh, I'm going to start with you.
Yeah, it's a great question. And look, I wish there was a simple answer, because if there was, I guess I'd be out of a job, which would suck, but it'd be great for everyone else. No, it's, I think, let me start by telling you what I think it's not in terms of building a sustainable family business. I don't think that there is a single right answer. I don't think that there is a silver bullet. And one of the things that's has been a bit concerning to me as I've learned about the space is I think sometimes there's a desire to sort of look for the best practice, the solution, whether it's like, okay, if we have a family constitution and all of our problems are solved. And in reality, every family business is different from each other. And not only that, but as families go through generations, the solutions and the practices and the models and everything that worked brilliantly in one generation can be a total disaster in the next. So I think the first key to all of this is don't look for that single answer and say, just because some other family business did something a certain way, or that we've done it a certain way for 50 years, that's going to be the thing that's going to help carry us through to the next generation. So instead of looking for those answers, it's really understanding that being a family business that lasts involves choices. And in particular, this is kind of the work that my colleague Rob and I have written about, is that it really comes down to understanding what it means to be the owners of a business. And ownership, we believe, is really the most powerful concept in the world of family business. It's one of the most powerful concepts in society. But I can say this as someone that teaches in a business school. We don't teach ownership. We teach management. We teach a little bit of corporate governance. We don't really teach what it means to be the owners of a business. And instead of, when we think about it, think about something you own, like a house or a car. What it means to be an owner is that you have the ability to make choices that no one else can make unless you give them permission. And so the work and making a family business last is about understanding those choices, having the conversation, sitting on the couch or around a table, rolling up your sleeves and saying, how do we want to really make these choices in a way that positions us to be successful?
Yeah, I totally agree. And Ramia, you've been nodding all the way through there. I'm sure that resonates with you.
Well, yeah, I think it's hard to disagree with anything Josh said here. Like, it's beautifully put how he puts it. And I agree, of course, there's no one size fits all. I think maybe I can bring in the perspective of, from all the families we've interviewed and just sort of like looking at commonalities, maybe common traits they shared, the ones that made it over a long amount of time. And I think one thing that really stands out to me, and it feeds into your comment about ownership, Josh, I think, one thing that really stood out to me always in these interviews with families that clearly think ahead, but also come from a legacy already, is that they share a very high level of awareness of their stakeholder environment. So who are their stakeholders? And they have deeply rooted relationships with all those stakeholder groups and very clear communication with all those stakeholder groups. And I think that's something like, a family business, whether it's like mine, which has like a weird shape, or whether it's more traditional, it's more central, it's more physical. We're always a network, really, right? Like, we're always networked into our stakeholder environment. And that stakeholder environment is what makes us strong, but also vulnerable. And the better our communication is with that stakeholder environment, I would say, the better the warning signals are to us when things are changing, for instance, right? But also the better the support is when, force majeure hits, like, for instance, COVID. And I know, Paul, you will have questions about that as well later on. So I think that's one thing that always strikes me about those leaders that I see that actually manage that multi-generational success, is that they have that network thinking around the family enterprise. So it's really like they're very good at managing what they have. And as you said, like Josh, they're very good owners, but they're networked owners, and they understand that their success hinges on the success of others, and they usually enable the success of others as well. And I feel like that's a very strong commonality I see across the board of those different families, and that's across the world, actually, regardless of culture.
Can I just build on that for a second, Paul?
Yeah, of course you can.
Yeah, I'm 100% agree, and that I would frame it as communication creates capital. And having good communication allows you to create the kinds of capital that family business needs. It creates sort of the human capital, the talent. When people understand, they're motivated, they're excited, they feel the mission, they feel the passion. It creates the financial capital when you have a group of owners that are feeling connected and engaged. They're in it for the long term. They're going to stick it out through times like this, and they're going to see the value of that long-term thinking. And then the social capital as well. When you have those, when you build those relationships, so many family businesses. I think of one that we work with in the liquor distribution business. They have a partnership with a wine seller that's been going on for decades, and that's been that. If you ask them why are you successful, that relationship is central to it. And there's so many examples like that with suppliers, with customers, with other people in your industry. Those relationships, that trust is built up over time. And how do you sustain that is actually a lot through that good communication and that network thinking, Ramia, that you're talking about.
It also propagates down into employees as well, Josh, doesn't it? In terms of, we see so many families collectively or family businesses that have had families and generations of the same families working for them because they've trusted the employers over the years too. So that whole trust thing is such a big thing that often gets forgotten or kind of put on the side and not really thought about, and it just happens rather than being managed. It's really important that that's on the agenda, isn't it?
Absolutely. No, I think that trusted relationships is the biggest single differentiator that family businesses can have compared to other kinds, or one of them. And it takes time, it takes nurturing, it takes connection, it takes all those things are over the long term. And I think that's what family businesses can be really good at. Is sort of playing that game, is playing that way, as opposed to the more short term, let us cut costs here and what's in it for me, as opposed to how do we create something that actually is valuable all around.
Josh, it just occurs to me that maybe one thing to add, Andrew, if I may, just add one more thought to this, another thing that I think is a common factor that some of these families share is that they are very much aware of their competitive advantages. So they're very good. They understand what makes them competitive. Now, I see actually a lot of businesses, a lot of family businesses as well, not having forgotten that or not being really very sharp about that, right? And I think those families who always understand what it is that makes them competitive, and this might change from one generation to another, right? That's the key here. Those families that are aware that, first of all, what makes them competitive, but also that a competitive advantage has to be played out to their advantage. It's not just something that stands there and it's enough to just have it, right? It's something that you play out, really, and to teach the next generation how to play to that competitive advantage. I think that's a skill that I see in a lot of those people that I admire a lot, that have been able to build things over many years. I mean, my father as well, I think, is someone who really knows how to lean into strength, right? Makes us competitive. And I think those are basically, I would say, I would add that trait basically as well to families that make it in the long run, probably.
Yeah, you hear them talk about, some of the families that I work with, and this is a topic, as Paul knows, is a passion of mine. I'm doing some research on how families create sustainable competitive advantages. And they think about how family ownership you can use that as a competitive weapon. How is it that you can actually use your family business and its things that makes it different as sort of differentiating traits in the market with customers and so on. And I think that, to your point, Ramia, when you have to really focus and remember that, and it can get lost. And when it does, there's lots of other businesses that are out there ready to eat your lunch. So you have to be really thoughtful and stay connected to that. And as you said, as it evolves over time, you have to evolve with it.
I couldn't agree with you both more. And actually, what's lovely is the way you're bouncing off each other. And actually, I don't actually say anything, which is even better than actually put an easier role this afternoon. So thank you for making my life easy. You both alluded to it. It's maybe a question I should have asked to start with, in terms of the kind of the special qualities and the special entities that family firms are. What do you think that makes family businesses so special, and that makes you want to work with them and engage with them and use them and deal with them on a daily basis? And do you think that the special qualities that family firms have helps them become more sustainable, or is it a hindrance?
Josh, you want to go first, or you want me to take that one?
Please.
Well, that's a controversial one for me, because I'm from a family business, right? So. Okay, I'm going to say something that you might not expect to hear from me right now, but I actually don't think that family businesses are special. I think family businesses make a lot of sense. I totally understand why they are the majority in any economy. For me, like it like being in one, interacting with others, like, you know, it's the family talent capital, the family trust capital, everything. Like, you know, and we, for instance, we have an immigrant background. It made sense for us to join forces. These things, like, you know, a family business, rather than being super special, I think just often just makes a lot of sense. It just makes a lot of sense until it doesn't, and then you get all those problems, right? Like, but so I think I wouldn't like, I don't really like the word special necessarily, because for me also, like, I worry about romanticizing family businesses, right? Like, because I think that, you know, I can tell you from experience that we don't walk around thinking of ourselves as a family business day to day. Like, you know, we are business owners, we have responsibilities, we have to grow businesses. That is our purpose, right? Like, and we don't necessarily think of ourselves as special or extraordinary in that sense. We are in a marketplace, we compete, or we try to compete, right? Like, so I think maybe special isn't the word. I think equipped for this century would be what I think is an interesting angle maybe here. And I don't know if Josh would back me on this, but I actually think for everything that we're facing in this particular 21st century, all of these questions about, you know, climate change, like everything that's like the technological advance and stuff like that, I think family businesses are actually the perfect type of player to tackle these kinds of large problems, but also smaller problems, because of our outlook towards long-term ownership. And I think this is the first time, even in my time of working, that I feel like that sort of that long outlook, that idea of, like, you know, not just exiting after 5 years, regardless of, you know, what you've done, that long outlook, that talking about generations to come, seems to be playing to our advantage. So maybe not special, but I would say very strongly positioned in this particular century, in view of what it is that we're going to have to resolve, guys. Like, there's just no way around it. It's all of our responsibilities. So
yeah. Well, I wrote a piece called "Why the 21st Century Will Belong to Family Businesses." So I guess I'm on the same page.
You're with me.
No,
You're with me, Josh.
I'm with you. No, and I think
one thing though. Like,
we'll find. I'm sure we'll find something to disagree on, but not yet. Not yet. And look, I think about it very similarly. I think businesses, different, if we think of different types of businesses, whether it's a public company or private equity or family business and so on, or even a state-run enterprise, they're all designed to solve certain problems. They're all better at solving certain problems than others, right? I mean, if we're talking about a tech business where it's all about a race to scale and there's only one winner, you know, they take all the benefits, like a Facebook or even a Google. I don't think that's something family businesses are very good at, because family businesses are not so great at taking in outside capital and sort of thinking about it, you know, a short-term perspective, all that kind of stuff. That's not a problem that family businesses are great at solving. Or if you look back into the industrialized economies of the 20th century, these were all about building these huge scaled businesses, railroads, and Ford Motor Company is a great example. They had to control the entire value chain. They used to graze sheep, so they had wool to go into seat covers, like everything end to end. And that's, again, family businesses are not great at solving the scale problem, not fast. Like you look at the large family businesses, and there are some huge ones out there. At least in the US, they're about 100 years old on average. So it's not like you can't get a huge family business, but it takes a while, right? It's not like Facebook or Google where it's going to happen in 3 to 5 years. But I'm with you. I think that let's put aside the 3 or 4 businesses that get 90% of the media attention.
I know.
And those I think are not great for family businesses, but you look at the rest of the economy, and I'm with you. I think the particular challenges that we're facing are things that family businesses are really well suited to resolve. And one of them you mentioned, I think, is really developing a long-term approach to business that doesn't think of sustainability and profitability as trade-offs, but sees them as long-term reinforcers of each other. And I work with so many family businesses that when they see those questions, they don't think about it, oh, I have to choose between making money and doing good. They understand that that's a short-term trade-off. But in the long term, investing in innovation, efficiency, investing in diversity and inclusion, the business case for those is strong. It's just not a quarterly business case. It's a 5-year or 10-year business case. And for reasons like that, I just think that the ability of family businesses to navigate and be the solution to so many of our problems of having an economy that continues to grow and expand, but not to the detriment of our people and our communities. This is a problem that family businesses are really well suited to solve.
Special's been put in my 101 bin and won't be mentioned again. But I guess what you both kind of described is kind of, ignore the word, but it's the sentiment in terms of the unique ability that the family business can react and adapt and evolve and do all those things that you've talked about and go long term. If we backtrack a bit further then, in terms of two of the things that we've talked about a lot this week is values and purpose. So Ramia, you said you were in business with your sister, and it was a natural thing for you to do. It was a natural thing for you to bond together and to do something in business together. But how important is that sense of engagement, purpose, to make the business stand a chance of succeeding for the long term? Those underlying values that you have and your sense of purpose as a collective sisterhood, but also in the broader context of family businesses, values and purpose, how important are they?
Okay, so first of all, I have to tell you, like, just because you were born into the same family, that doesn't necessarily mean that you share the exact same values or that you emphasize those values in the same way. Okay, so my sisters and I are as close as sisters can get. I would say, especially over these last 2 years when we had to pull through this pandemic. I think like we've come out. I'm very proud of us. Like we've really gone through a lot of communication improvements and stuff like that, and now we feel like we're really thriving there on a fantastic, very healthy communication level, like, you know, but that was like daily conversations and sometimes daily conflict. And this is the two people that I consider to be almost like, you know, each a third of my own being, like, so closer than that it doesn't get. So first of all, I don't never take it for granted that just because you're related to someone that means you have shared values or shared purpose, right? Like shared values and shared purpose is something that you have to work on every day. We've been working very consciously towards alignment, even if, like, you know, we wanted to give everyone this freedom to say, like, we want you to, each one of us, to be their own person, to have their own emphasis on certain things. Like, you know, Shireen is very different in her outlook towards what's important than I am. So is Farida. So we wanted all of that to have place, but then to still kind of like make sure that we're on the same track for the business, right? Like, so what came out uppermost was like this whole conversation. You can call it purpose, you can call it values, you can call it whatever you want. But when force majeure, like a pandemic hits, what we just did was to just talk about, okay, guys, what's actually important? Let's just cut out everything else that feels like noise. And just like, let's talk about what is important to each one of us and then find common denominators. And that's how we did it. And that's how we managed to simplify an exercise that somehow I sometimes feel like is being, again, like, you know, the danger of romanticizing these conversations, because ultimately it's that, right? Like, I mean, we are business people. Our job here is to ensure the jobs of our employees. Our job here is to be, like, you know, like Josh said, our job here is to be good owners. So we need to get a grip on whatever misalignment we have between us. And so, like, I think the driving force behind finding purpose as a family business is that you have a responsibility towards those stakeholders that we were talking about. You have a responsibility to get that straight. But again, just because you're family, that doesn't necessarily come naturally, right? Like, I mean, I was talking to my sisters the other day, like, you know, it's really weird. We have the same parents, like, you know, I mean, no doubt about it. You could do DNA tests. We definitely have the same parents. But guys, like, we have totally different parents. You see what I mean? Like, it's not the same childhood just because you share it, and it's not the same kinship just because you share it. So I think, first of all, to put aside this assumption that just because it's family, it's necessarily closer or easier to understand. On the contrary, actually, sometimes it's even harder. But once the understanding is built, I agree, then there is an ease to the communication. Once alignment is there in a family, I think it's probably the most powerful thing that can happen, because definitely then the kinship kind of kicks in, and that's sort of like, you know, that vibing off each other. Like, you know, my sister says half a sentence and I know where she's going, right? Like, and so that's great in moments where you need to make quick decisions, in moments where you need to make tough decisions, where you need to support each other, have each other's backs. And so, yeah, so that will be my I guess my take on it, not that, so my point being like super important to find common purpose and values, but not to just assume that just because you're related, that will just be a natural process. It's definitely an engineered and very forced process at times. And, but the result is well worthwhile the effort. That's what I would say.
And just to build on that, I'm sure we'll disagree at some point, not yet. I love the word alignment. I think that's one of the most important words in the family business field in making all this work, is because you're not looking for what's the objectively right answer. You're looking for that sense of common understanding and viewpoint, and that allows you then to go and do so many great things together. But yeah, I think purpose is so important. This class I teach in called Managing Conflict in Family Business, we talk about different strategies for managing conflict, and one of them is purpose. And the reason is because purpose helps you to deal with all of the inevitable arguments and differences of opinion. And one of the examples that's really stuck with me, there's a book called High Altitude Leadership that looks at leadership through the lens of expeditions, climbing Everest and K2 and so on. And what the authors talk about is that most expeditions fail on the way down, not on the way up. On the way up, we all, in this case, we have this literal mountain to climb in front of us. I'm not so worried about whether, you're doing a little bit less of the work or I'm taking a little bit less of the food. Like, we all understand that if we don't work together seamlessly, we're going to fail, right? It's not going to work. But then once we accomplish this great goal, that's when the knives come out, right? That's when I start to think less about what we're doing collectively, because the collective goal is achieved, and more about how I'm doing relative to you. And that's when the conflicts really start to get much more severe. And so one of the reasons why purpose is so important is because it gives you that sense of why, that sense of let's sacrifice together. If we don't sacrifice for each other, for this common goal, then we won't be able to achieve it. And not unfortunately, I guess maybe fortunately to family business, what happens is that you succeed your way out of that initial sense of purpose. If you ask a founder, why did you start that business? The answer is usually some version of, I had to, because I had to put food on the table, or, like I had to put my kids into school, or I had this idea and I just couldn't put it down. I was compelled to, right? But then you do it, you achieve it. And then if you don't start to, as Ramia said, you don't start to recreate it all the time, you start to hear people talk about, well, why are you in business together? Well, we have an obligation, we have a responsibility, we don't want to ruin what our predecessors did. That's not compelling. That is not giving you a reason to sacrifice. That's not the same thing as those early generations of purpose that happen more naturally. And so I think you have to take the time in each generation, and sometimes multiple times a generation, to get after that why question. Because if you don't, that's when the disagreements that are inevitable start to overwhelm that sense of common destiny that you can create together.
Can I just build on that a little bit, Andrew, if you don't mind? Because let's see if Josh agrees with me with the next thing I'm going to say, because I'm really curious to hear both of your thoughts on this. So the last few years, not just the pandemic, just the last few years, have been, I think, tough on many economies and tough on many family businesses, right? So it didn't just take the pandemic, even before then. I mean, I think, Andrew, you can probably talk to the UK very well as well, how that's been, and Josh, no comment for the US there. I think you guys have also been through difficult times.
Sure.
I think what's super important and what we don't talk about enough in family businesses is how to bridge the times where there is no purpose or a lack of purpose. So, because what I've noticed in our family business, but what I also see in others, is those that come out on top are the ones who understand that sometimes that lack of clarity, it takes time. And how do you bridge that time? How do you bridge that moment of uncertainty? And do not go into panic mode, do not subside to fear, and do not give space for conflict there. So for us, it had a lot to do with pushing deep on loyalty at that moment. When you have that moment where the purpose might not be clear, the why is not clear cut, but we're working our way towards it, then that sense of loyalty has to kick in, where you're okay, I'm going to stick to this boat, right? Regardless of whether I'm not entirely sure where it's going to land right now. And I think because murky waters is most of the waters for family businesses. It's not those moments of clarities are few and far between. Like, you know what I mean? Like, it's not always like the moment you clear one thing up, the next thing, like, you know, is on your desk, basically, where you're like, okay, I got to find a solution to that. And even though there is alignment now, like we constantly come across these moments of like, oh, okay, hold on. And so often we've come to the conclusion, this cannot be solved today. This might not even be able to be solved next week. This might take us continued discussion until the end of the year, until we see eye to eye, until we have a strategy, until we know why we're doing this particular thing. So I'm just wondering, maybe for both of you, the question, like bridging that time of uncertainty, like, you know, how to make sure the family sticks together, how to make sure no one jumps ship, because that's actually the majority of the time. And that's just business, isn't it? And entrepreneurship and being a business owner, there's just a lot of that uncertainty.
Yeah, totally. I guess from just in terms of context in the UK, we've just finished a 2-week round. It's our first actual in-person event. We did a 2-week Scottish family business road trip. We visited 45 family businesses on the road. The last 2 years have definitely been, but the words that came through were brutal, and it was really difficult on lots of levels. And we're now dealing with the fallout of Brexit and some supply chain issues, not enough staff. There's all sorts of other issues as well. So COVID is part of a bigger mix of uncertainty and ongoing challenges facing businesses in the UK today. There's murky waters. I think if you go back to when the pandemic first hit, especially here in the UK, there was a lot of shock. There was a lot of real uncertainty in terms of people stopped trading overnight. Some businesses just stopped. They had no choice. And so businesses over here went into one of two modes. They either reacted quickly or they had time to think and reflect and then take some more sort of midterm decisions because they had time, because they couldn't trade in the short term. And actually the response, as you said, Ramia, in terms of the loyalty of staff and the management teams was phenomenal. The biggest challenge I think we saw here was the communication issue. And family firms had to adapt to different ways of communicating. So we had CEOs sending out video messages once a week or dealing with their 2,000 staff in open forum where they would take any question any member of staff asked, which is phenomenal. And some of those questions were really hard because they had some difficult decisions to make. But I think it's not all positive in terms of Rosie being a CEO or a family business leader running through a pandemic or a big challenge or a big crisis. But I think some of the questions you alluded to there, they took instantly because they had to. And they probably had a better end result by taking some quick decisions, even though they were difficult decisions, but being honest up front straight away. And then others followed once they'd worked out what their strategy was. So I think the other positive for me was that family business owners here in the UK and probably around the world had time to make real strategic decisions as a family coming together around the table. And that's where the unity and all the positive things you said about alignment up front and the culture of the way the family talks to each other stood them in good stead. I think we're not out of the woods yet by any way, shape or form, but I think those underlying facets, if you get them right up front, enable you to have those really difficult conversations at a period of crisis and hopefully make the right decisions. But I could list 3 or 4 families that will say we didn't make the right decisions, but we've stood by what we did and we've had to make the best of it once we know more information. But none of us knew, so it was an ongoing battle, really. Josh, I don't know if that's
Yeah, and maybe going back a little bit to that conversation, about purpose. I think you can almost think about purpose because it comes in 2 flavors, at least 2 different kinds. One is we could think about, I'll call it positive purpose, like if we work together, we're going to like conquer the world and everything's going to be great and it's going to be wonderful, and that's very inspiring. There's another one that you could think of as, you could call it negative purpose, which has a negative connotation to it, but it's really thinking about what are we going to lose if we don't work together. And that is sometimes that can be incredibly motivating. Like if we may not be able to, the next year may be terrible, but if we don't stick together, we're not going to be able to make it through. We're going to lose something that we value significantly. And to really think about what is going to happen if we lose that sense of alignment and we start focusing on what's in it for me and those kinds of conversations. And I think sometimes, I think some version of both is probably healthy. I think ultimately you don't want to just be defining yourself as, if we don't stick together, we're going to lose something. But I think in those moments, if you can't come up with this sort of inspirational, aspirational kind of view as to what you can have, at least getting together and saying, look, these are tough times, but if we don't come together, we're gonna lose everything that we have. And you see these examples happen, when families are threatened, some competitor wants to take them over or something like that. Everyone rallies around that kind of effort. And I think you can use that sense of a little bit of an us them. You want to be careful with it, but a little bit of that us them kind of approach can help you to bridge through those times until you can get something that feels more like we're aspiring, we're trying to get something to accomplish. And I think this moment of COVID has been a great example where I've seen of a lot of families that have come together and said, we had all these big things we thought we could accomplish, but now we're just trying to protect our people and protect our jobs, like their safety and their employment, and do the right thing. And that can be something that can still get you through those difficult times.
Been very revealing, hasn't it?
Yeah, for sure.
And I'm sure there are some challenges that lie ahead on the back end of coming out too, that will be opportunities for some family businesses, and others will struggle to maybe deal with them. But yeah, it's an interesting concept, isn't it? Ramia, your sisters and you working together in your family firm or your family business, kind of almost like an aside, because it's slightly different to the question I want to ask, but obviously Generation One founder, entrepreneurial spirit, drive, determination, focused on whatever their passion is. As we move through the generations and that founder's dream becomes kind of a bit of the history and the legacy that's left behind, what sort of things do businesses need to introduce in order to give them a greater chance of success in terms of frameworks, structures? What tools should they be thinking about? What conversations should they be having to help them on that journey as it goes from Generation One to maybe 2, 3, 4, and 5?
Well, I think it's probably a very different question going from 1 to 2 than going from 2 to 3 or 3 to 4, right? Like, I think that's probably massively influenced also by the size of the business, etc. But like, just give you maybe, what I really liked, what like a great thinker in this space and academic and one of the founders of this field, Ivan Landsberg, once said to me, like, when the first generation tries to teach the second generation how to run the family business, it's like a tennis player trying to coach a basketball team, right? Like, and it's a little bit that, and he really helped me a lot by saying that to me, because I remember that really resonated with me. I'm like, yeah, this is the big challenge, isn't it? Like, because it's a very different thing. Like, we have to, first of all, we are immediately confronted with multiple owners. Like, there's multiple ownership. There's also obviously a massive need to grow the actual, grow the actual business, so that, like, there's enough for everybody, if you will. Like, that's the mentality usually, right? Like, and I think if I look at all the families I've interviewed, I think, like, and this might sound repetitive from what I said before, but I do think that there's maybe one thing that is a common thing throughout every generational transition. Let me start with the commonality, just like Josh did before, starting with what like a sustainable family business is maybe not, like, but like for me, like the commonality across all these generational transitions is you have to transition the network from one generation to the next. Okay, like, you cannot skip this stage. Like, this is so important for me. I feel like so many family businesses, like, they're so focused on the succession moment as a internal family moment, like, as a, like, from one family member to another. It's a whole network that the next generation has to understand, and then has to be allowed to, like, sort of like live in on their own terms, right? Like, so if you look at my parents' generation versus ours, like, first of all, my dad has been blessed with 3 daughters, okay, like, so no sons, okay. So we were born into a generation where, yes, admittedly, the whole concept of, like, us being 3 women, I could put in the mixed race, if you like, for fun's sake, right? Like, and all of these things, like, it's maybe more accepted, but it's still a challenge. And it's a challenge that, for instance, I cannot explain to my father or my mother, because it's impossible for me to make them understand. And they appreciate that, like, they don't expect to. But I think that just that alone, just the context being so different in time and in circumstances, means that I really believe that you have to look at your family business. Every single generation has to look at it through a different lens and allow it to be something different. And don't get me wrong, that doesn't mean that you necessarily change what you do, but you do have to look at it in a different way, because you cannot, like, for me, continuity has nothing to do with doing things the exact same way or looking at them the exact same way. Continuity comes through people having the courage to actually look at things differently all the time, having the courage to taking a 360 view, having the courage to recognize signals when they're there. So not put heads in the sand and just ignore what's going on. And so, look, a generational transition forcefully does that. Like, we cannot possibly look at this the same way like our father does or our mother does. It's impossible for us to do that. First of all, because like, again, like, the mixed thing comes in, right? Like, we don't come from one culture, we're like, multicultural. So anyways, we can't look at it the same way. Then secondly, there's multiple owners. There's three of us. We have to agree. The three of us have to agree on how we run our businesses. So 3 people to agree takes a lot of energy and a lot of time. So my dad was just able to decide to do whatever he wanted. And when I say my dad, I mean my mother, of course, who actually made every single decision in our family, but I think and it is a totally different mindset towards it. And I think you approach things very differently. So I think for me, there's that the biggest difference is the accountability piece. So of course, as a founder, you're just accountable to yourself mostly, and then slowly your employees and stuff like that. Then there's the ownership accountability piece that comes in with every generation. And then there's just I don't think I've seen any successful family business that has tried to force the exact same perspective on the business for a generation to over many generations and being successful. I don't think it's possible. I just don't think it's realistic. Might happen sometimes with a very small niche that for a while there, it looks like, you got away with it. Like maybe if you are a jeweler or something very specific, sometimes craftsmanship based family businesses kind of get away with it a little bit because it's a very specific trade. But even they are faced today in this century with like a total disruption of their environment, and the next generation that's going to have to think about the family business in a very different way. I don't know if that made any sense, but like that's just my.
Yeah, I get it. I get it, because that's what you're talking about. Is each generation has to find their own purpose, and actually put their own spin on something. So they've got to get out of bed every morning to own their business, run their business, and do what they have to do to make it work. I think the other thing I kind of picked up on was, I think Josh, you said it, and then it was reiterated, Ramia, by you, was the transition is not just a moment. And actually, I think too often the world that we all operate in terms of the advisory world, the wealth management, the banking system, the accountants, they talk about the liquidity moment almost as though it is a moment, and the other stuff is almost secondary. And actually, the moment is the start, when everything else should have been done beforehand and then followed through afterwards. So I think you're right. I'd echo the moment isn't necessarily as big a deal as all the stuff that needs to go before in conversation and then come through afterwards. Josh, just your take on what Ramia said.
No, I yet again agree. I mean, when we looked at sort of common traits, it wasn't things like, did you have, this particular governance structure or that kind of a thing. It was more of I would call them like the family cultural environment. And the 3 things that we found were very much aligned. One was the families that succeed tend to be curious. They ask a lot of questions. They attend conferences like this one. They read magazines like Tharawat. Like they're interested to know what's going on in the world and don't believe that they've got all the answers inside, because it's complicated. You're not going to be able just to figure it out by staying internal. You're going to have to look externally. The second thing is they understand that's a team sport. I mean, certainly after the founding generation, it is like going from tennis to basketball. I think that's a great analogy. It requires an ability and a willingness to team within and across generations. And the family businesses that struggle are ones, sometimes where that founder just is unwilling to bring anyone in. And, sometimes the second generation is able to pick it up, despite having been shut out forever, and sometimes not. And those are some of the ones that don't end up working. But that sense of teaming and working together and understanding the importance of collaboration is really important. And then the third one is adaptability, that, you can't expect that the way that you've run a business, is going to be the same, the way that you interact, the way that you make decisions. It's going to have to evolve. And those that are able to last, not surprisingly, are those that realize and recognize that and almost lean into that and say, look, we have to figure out what are the things that we have that are permanent, are, sometimes those might be our values or, some of our things that we really think are important. And what are the things that we're willing to change and evolve as we go across different business environments, different family environments.
Can I just add also to that, Josh? I don't know if you'd agree with that, but I think we really need to have a diversity conversation in this whole family business environment. As much as we seek alignment, of course, as a family, I do also think that diversity is a very key ingredient now to be a business that is adapted to what's about to happen. So if you do not have diverse voices at leadership level, and that can be family or non-family, I do not think you can survive. And I think this is like, this includes for me just as much as I really don't want to have that conversation anymore, which is like, should women be in these leadership positions? Of course, like I don't even want to go there anymore, but like,
Yeah.
you know, if as a family business today, you don't understand that like all next gens should be considered and given a voice, you don't have a future. If as a family business, you don't understand that leadership today is a team sport, as you said, you know, Josh and Paul as well, I think it resonates with what you said before, then you don't have a future, because the complexity of the environment is such and so fast paced that it is impossible for one single person anymore, for the patriarch, I'm sorry to put it this way, to make every single decision the right way. Now it might still, if you want to portray that to the outside world, that there's still one big like figurehead in the family, that's your business, but make sure that that figurehead has a very, very diverse team of thinkers behind them. Because I don't think that any business, let alone a family business that wants to last for generations to come, has a future without diverse thinkers, like, you know, that diversity deeply embedded in their culture.
Yeah, and I mean, I do agree, and I think diversity comes in lots of different shapes and sizes. I think when we think about gender diversity and you know, different other forms of diversity, like that's one thing.
Yeah.
But I think another thing is just having accepting a diversity of opinions within a family.
Exactly.
And the nature of families is that we have both this cooperative impulse, and we also have this competitive impulse. And you know, siblings are both understanding that these are the longest relationships of our lives and we can only do great things together, and we're competing for our parents' attention. And both those things are there. And because of the competitive part, it's natural. You know, we are usually especially the closer in age we are to our siblings, the less alike we are. And that's not an accident. It's because each person needs their own space within a family. And if someone, often the eldest, is taking the, you know, status quo space, then someone else has to take the challenger space. And you know, one of the things you see in families that succeed is that they have these different opinions. Some are more interested in growth, others are more careful, and that either is a great balancing act or it's a source of unending conflict, right? And the families that are able to be successful are those that see these different opinions, even within the same family, that grew up with the same parents, right? Very different perspectives on the world. How do you harness those together and see the value and respect them together? If you're able to do that, then great things are possible. If you're able to say there's one way of looking at the world and it's my way, then good luck to you.
Yeah, I'd echo both of your comments there. I think diversity is really important, and I actually think it's important that we consider diversity in the broadest possible way. The world's changing, the demographics of the world are changing, so we have to understand, and family businesses have to adapt, and the people within them then have to adapt to meet the needs of the changing world in which they need to remain relevant and current, and actually be able to provide a sustainable business for their family going forward too. So it's a complex scenario. I tend to agree with you in terms of there are some fantastic women leading family businesses around the world and some fantastic women, but it's not just about the women. That's kind of like 1990s. We've done that. We just need to open the conversation and find, a bit like Jim Collins's comment, you need to get the right people on the bus and then put the right people in the right seats on the bus to drive your family business forward. So wherever they come from.
But you know, it's the weird thing, Paul, about like, you're talking legacy. You want to build a legacy, but to build a legacy, you cannot be afraid of change.
Exactly.
Right? Building a legacy does not happen by doing the same thing over and over again.
No.
Building a legacy is by you being unafraid of the fact that things change all the time. Right? Like, and it's surfing that wave that makes you survive the generations to come, right? Like, and that's why also, again, like, I'm against romanticizing family enterprises, because that nostalgia that other people also feel towards us sometimes prevents us from taking the right decision at the right times. Like, you know, everyone expects us to stay the same and stuff like that. It is not realistic for a business to stay the same. It can't. It shouldn't. In fact, I would claim it shouldn't, right? Like, so I think exactly what you're saying, Paul, it's totally true. But I think it's that paradox somehow in people's minds for them, like when, you know, family businesses, it's tradition, it's legacy. Yeah, but they did not get there by doing the same thing for 100 years. They didn't. They adapted, they changed, and they, like, you know, they might still be here, but like they've done a, like, you know, a makeover 100 times over, basically, right? Like, and I think that's the part that I think is sometimes well hidden from the public, but I think anyone within a family business actually knows it's a required exercise for all of us.
Well, and I think I totally agree. And so much of this is the stories we tell, right? Because there's a version of the story of the founding of a business that tells it as this smooth, linear path to success with someone who could do no wrong and made all these great decisions. And of course, that's never the case. I mean, most entrepreneurial stories are full of mistakes and missteps. I think one of the families I work with, one of the most successful businesses they built in the US, the founder of it, he had all these other ideas that didn't work out. And the version that ended up being successful was not his first version. It was like his fifth version. And what made them successful was not that they were immune to mistakes. It was the ability to make mistakes and move on and adapt, right? And so that's partly is, do we tell the story of the founding generation and put them on the hill and say they could do no wrong? We must try to emulate them. Well, yes, let's emulate them, but which version are we emulating? Are we emulating the real version that involves the ups and downs and the failures and the near tragedy and we almost went out of business 12 times? Are we emulating the version that we see at the end, which is this very successful, well put together, well-oiled machine? And we have to be really careful in our families about which story that we're telling, and which version of that we want to pass down.
This is so true. And you know how often, Josh, is it actually coincidence and luck? Right?
Sure.
Like, okay, fine. You get to the lucky moment and you get to the coincidence because you're persistent and you're stubborn and you're courageous, and I'll credit you that. But how often do we get lucky? Of course we do. Like, you know what I mean? Like, and I love that you're saying that. It's the story. It's how you create that narrative. You can pretend in hindsight 2020 like we always knew what we were doing. I always tell people very frankly, I would love to tell you that we knew exactly what we were doing, and that would be an outright lie. I would love to tell you right now, I could make a story up and I'd be very good at it too, like Paul knows. Like, I was like, and then we thought like, this is a strategic moment. We didn't think it was a strategic moment. We had a fight, then we had to talk with someone else, and then we shifted somehow, and we did it subconsciously almost, right? Like, so it's that honesty, I think, about that should be predominant in the conversation, especially for the next generation. Because I feel like for the next gens to really know what they're getting into, right? Like, and to understand how it works, and to understand that mistakes are really okay. Failure is really okay. It's part of it. I think that is such an important conversation to have, especially when you are born into, you don't choose to be born into a family business. I didn't choose to be born to a very ambitious set of parents, right? Like that, like. And I think that's I think that's just it's a circumstance of birth almost that you're thrown into, but how you sort of make sense of that, and with how much sense of humor you get to approach that story as well, right? Like, I think that's a big factor actually in it. I love that you brought up the story. I think the narrative is totally key. You're right, especially inside the family. It's super key. Absolutely.
There are so many, aren't there? There are so many myths around the family business that get perpetuated sort of day in, day out. And I think you're right. I think there's a great opportunity for all family businesses today to sit down and document what they've done in the last 18 months during the pandemic, when they've had to make difficult decisions, hard decisions, they've had to fire employees, and even just to document that thought process they've gone through, because it's been really tough and they've learned from it. And I think the beauty of talking to you two is, and events like this, is that families learn from the journey of other families, where they're honest about the things. Almost they want to hear the things that have gone wrong and how they've turned them around, rather than just it's not all rosy. So I think it's really important that we talk about that. There's also one, and I have to bring this up, there's that whole rags to riches and rags again in 3 generations, based on a piece of research that was done X number of years ago, based on 25 businesses, that actually the people that come into this field and that are new to the field read it and start to quote it because they see it as the headline. And actually it's so untrue. There are so many family firms that have lasted so much longer than 3 generations and been successful, that research, I think, undermines the great things that lots of other family businesses do too. So I think it's incumbent on people like us in the community to embrace those difficult conversations that people may not want to hear, but to actually put them out there into the real world, so that people are starting on the right foundations, and it's not just based on what the rhetoric or as you say, Ramia, the positive things. It's actually about the real things and having the real conversations that I think make a difference.
And Paul, as you know, I'm a big advocate of this point of view. I think the 3 generations mythology is the most damaging idea in the field of family business. And like I was guilty when I first joined this field like 15 years ago. It's a great scare tactic. But unfortunately, it's become something of like a trope. Like everyone just says it, oh, family businesses don't last for 3 generations. I have students who come to class first day. They say, I'm from whatever, I'm in the 3rd generation, I'm the one who's going to ruin the business. I'm like, no,
God, that's horrible.
This is not at all the case. I mean, look, all the data is really telling you is that having a business last for 3 generations, which is 90 years, 100 years, is really hard. Well, okay, I don't think you needed an analysis to tell you most businesses fail within a year. New businesses, most businesses don't last 5 or 10 years. It's not so surprising that if we took a group of family businesses and asked how many lasted for that long, the answer would not be most of them wouldn't. But the problem with the idea is that people then take that information, which by the way applies even more so with non-family businesses, and then say somehow, well, therefore something is broken about family businesses, right? Which is just not the case. To Paul, to your point, most of the longest lasting businesses in the world are owned by families. Like if you want your business to last, the single best way, best mode of ownership is family ownership. That doesn't mean it's easy. That doesn't mean there's a guarantee of success or any of those things. But to sort of be putting this idea that somehow family businesses are fragile and destined to fail and all those things, I think is just completely unhelpful and not really supported by the evidence that we have on this. So sorry, I'll get down off my soapbox.
I agree with you. I would disagree with you, but I can't. I want to get onto the people aspect of family business, because people are the very essence of what family firms are all about and have to wear lots of hats, be it a shareholder, be it a director, maybe a management employee, or just being, and I don't mean the word just in terms of just being, but just being part of a family that owns a business but doesn't have any major role and maybe doesn't even own shares. How important is it, and do you think people understand enough about the different roles and how they interact? Because I often think that because they don't appreciate the role of an owner versus an employee. If you may be an owner employee, so there's 2 hats at different times. Do you think people understand the difference in roles enough and actually make allowances or structures within their businesses to segregate the different hats? And what can they do to make sure they get the best chance again of success with all those different roles going on in a business? And I'm going to come to you, Josh, because I know you've got a model. So
oh, all right, is that the cue? Yeah. So I'll talk just briefly. We have this way of looking at the world of family business we call the 4-room model, and basically the intuition is just like in your house. You do different work, you make different decisions in the kitchen where you're deciding what's for dinner versus the living room where you're deciding what are we going to watch on Netflix. In a family business, you have these different types of decisions. You do different types of work. And the 4 are the management room, which is where you run the business day to day. You have the boardroom, which is where you make strategic decisions. Where are we going? Who should be our CEO? Those kinds of decisions. You have the owner room, which is where you're deciding things like, should we be a private company or go public? Should we pay out our profits and dividends or redistribute them back into the company? Are there certain things we won't do, even though they might make us money because they're against our values? And then you have the family room. And the first 3 are kind of a hierarchy. The management answers to the board answers ultimately selected by the owners. We plan to put the family room on the side with the idea that the family is not about making business decisions. It's about creating cohesion among family members and relationships. It's about developing the next generation. Sometimes it's about managing family assets like a vacation home or a foundation. And a lot of the value that we see in this kind of simple structure is understanding the different roles that people can play inside of a family business. And I think, Paul, to your point, that there's value in all of them. I mean, a family that is successful over time is not because they've just had, it's not because the CEO is the only important role. It's you've got a great board, you've got a family council leader that is really focused and energized on the next generation and inclusion and things like that. You've got owners that are doing their role, and maybe I'll just highlight and I'll stop after this. I think one of the things I think is the most underestimated value in a family business is the passive capital. Someone who is willing to leave their money in the business even when they're not actively involved in it. We tend to dismiss that almost entirely. Remember speaking at a conference in Thailand years ago, and a person raises his hand and says, I'm running this business and I have these 2 siblings who are not. Why should I allow them? Why should they be owners? Why should they get the benefit of all the hard work that I'm doing? And my question back to him was, well, what's the alternative? If you had to basically buy them out, either you're going to have to take on a bunch of debt, and maybe the business will go under. We won't be able to reinvest back in it for growth, or you're going to have to take in some other equity partner who might be a lot more demanding than your two siblings. And so really understanding the value of these different roles that people can play, I think, is critical to this working over the long term.
Yeah, cool. I'd agree. I totally agree with you. Ramia, is there anything you want to add to that? Or
Yeah, I mean, I love Josh, when you were when you were on our podcast as well, right? Like, you guys just such a good job explaining that model. And I really like it. I think that for me, it's a very, of course, it's for any family business member, it's a very fluid conversation, right? Like, I mean, there's the roles you that are thrust upon you, I would say. Then there's the roles that you're born, like, as I said, you're born into, they're thrust upon you. You have the roles that you aspire to. You have the roles that that's sort of like, it's all different. They all come from a different corner. Sometimes it's obligation, sometimes it's ambition and stuff like that. So I think it's a very fluid conversation for us. And I think the most important thing that you need to realize as a family member, eventually, that you need to reconcile with yourself as an individual, is, what does adding value look like for you, right? And once you have that figured out, like, once you're clear about, like, what does that look like for me personally, how do I add value, then I think it doesn't really matter which hat you wear. Like, then you are in the clear with yourself, and others also know what to expect from you. Like, what I don't believe is this idea that I need to be like, what I see creating a lot of dissonance is this idea I need to be a different person if I'm an owner, if I'm a if I'm a manager, if I'm a like a committee member. It's finding that basically a little bit like, your own magic, I guess I could call it, like, your own method to, and what does working hard look like for you? Like, what does adding value look like for you? And sort of be really reconciled with that narrative of yourself, and, like, just really understanding that. And then I think, again, any hat you wear, you'll find that groove, and you'll be comfortable, and others will be able to recognize you, like, in the style and in the way that you approach these things, right? Like, and I think that gives us sort of like predictability. Like, I think, like, a family business, of course, is not necessarily an environment for wild cards, right? Like, that has to be said. Like, you do not want to be that family member. I also always say, like, we have to be very clear. Like, the devil's advocate should not be part of the family business. It is not a constructive position to take. Like, but someone who adds value differently from you, that, yes, because you need people adding different ways, doing that in a different way, and bringing, to our previous point, bringing different ways of thinking to the table. So I think I would look at it like that, because I have to, like, I think I have like a huge wardrobe of hats, probably, like on a daily, that I wear on a daily basis, right? Like, and I think the only way that I've been able to not, I guess, lose my mind as well, like, because the last few years have not been easy for anyone, has been by just trying to stay as true to myself and what is actually I think is doing a good job look like, regardless of which role I was taking. And then also not to, I would say, like, maybe have those roles encompass my entire identity as a person. I think in the family business, as a family member in the family business, we are in real danger in feeling that the role that we get attributed from the family business defines almost our whole life or our whole identity. And not to forget, you have to work on the wholeness of your life. And that means, like, really sort of like cultivating your personality, outside of the business context, so that you don't have to, in moments where it's difficult in the business, for instance, it becomes really oppressive when this is all you have, when that role becomes your identity. Like, your identity should be bigger to me than the role that you have in the enterprise or in the legacy. So yeah, that would be my sort of like, I think, that's my very, very personal view on this, like on this question.
Yeah, and I think what can also be oppressive is the sense that you have to do it a certain way. And I think at the end of the day, there are many different ways to be successful in a different role, and there are many different successful models of leadership. And sometimes there's a tendency to say the first, second, whatever generation before you led in a certain way, so therefore you have to fit into that box. And I think that is also can be a really big mistake. That there are most importantly is that the leadership style that you adapt, or that you adopt, is authentic, because otherwise it's not going to seem real to everyone. People are going to see through it, and it's not going to be sustainable because you're putting something on, right? So you have to find a way to serve in these different roles that really does connect to who you are, not to who someone else in a previous generation was, or who you're expected to be. But at the same time, I think, and not to disagree, I don't think you're saying this, Ramia, but you do have to be willing to adapt your role. Like if you are the CEO of the business, you're the boss, like you get to make the final call and decisions. When you step into the boardroom or the owner room, like, you might be a 1/3 owner. And in that environment, you're not the boss, like you're a peer.
Well, but Josh, like your responsibilities will vary, but then again, like your approach to taking, like understanding those responsibilities should be the same. That's all I'm saying. I totally agree with you. Like your scope of, and I think control and power is a very attractive discussion, by the way, that we should all have together, like one day, about the family business, because that's a big one, isn't it? Like power, need for power and control in the family enterprise. It's one of the biggest things. But I guess what I'm saying here is that, like, if you don't, if you're not honest with yourself as well, and this is what I always tell, like, I get a lot of next gens asking me, like, should I join the family business, or like, should I do something else, or like, should I stay outside? I always tell them the same thing. Like, if you want to join the family business, you have to be willing to work on yourself a lot. Like, you have to understand you're going to have to invest in your personal growth, because this environment is going to require a level of introspection. If you're a family member, right? Like I would say, if you're a family member, it's going to require a level of introspection and you being reconciled with a lot of what happened at the family level. And that sometimes means work, depending on what kind of family you come from, right? Depending on what kind of circumstances we're talking about. And if you're not willing to do that work, and I think this is the most frequent type of entitlement that I actually see. I don't see so much entitlement about like, like money or something like that. I see a lot of entitlement about, I'm joining the family business. What's the family going to do for me? How are they going to treat me? Right? Like, as opposed to thinking about, well, how do I have to grow as a person, not just as a skilled professional, but as a person, to really make the best of this and to add that value. I was talking, really to be given responsibility and to be good at taking that responsibility. I think it's that kind of an environment. It's an environment that demands that. I feel like it's just a lot of hard work.
And I absolutely. And I think what should be communicated ultimately is that work can make you a better person at the end of the day. It is something that, it does require you to learn all kinds of skills that you would not have to learn if you didn't work in your family's business. But those are skills that I think are ultimately part of reaching our full versions of ourselves. And one of the reasons I love this work is that I get at least a sliver of that, because I see other families, because I'm continually learning, for my own, to be able to be good at my job. I have to continue to learn about all kinds of things that I never would have had to if I was working in some other environment. And I bring those home with me, or I try to, and they make me a better husband, a better father, a better son. And I think that that's really the potential out there, that putting yourself into an environment of complexity, relationship complexity, and all the kinds of things that a family business brings. If you are going to be resistant to that, it's going to be incredibly painful. But if you are willing to open yourself up to that, it can be so powerful as a person. And one of the things in class, I bring in these guest speakers, and I have this one who was in a few weeks ago, and he's been a guest speaker in class for 6 years. And I was just commenting, I even said to him out loud, I couldn't contain this thought. I'm like, you've become so wise. And it's because he suffered, he struggled working with his parents. It was so hard for him personally to deal with and manage that. But the way that he looks at the world now is just remarkable. I'm just awed by it. And I think that's the promise, right? Is that if you put yourself in this environment of difficulty and so on, you can come out the other side as sort of a more well-rounded person, having all these skills that you never would have even thought to have. And those can lead to a fuller life.
So, I'd agree with you, Josh, completely. And Rami, I think it's a really fulfilling sector to work in. We meet so many different people every day, and I think for me that's the joy, is you never quite know who you're going to talk to, what their journey's been, or their story, and all the romanticized bits that, Rami, you talk about. We love those. I mean, the story of biscuits that were made for 100 years, or rugs and everything else, but actually it's about the reality. There's so much more that I'd love to talk to you about, but we're running out of time. I mean, I'd love to have covered things like trusted relationships and governance, the importance of communication, which is key to all of the things we've talked about today. But one last question for you now, and obviously we're talking in a time when the world is changing quite rapidly, and we've been through a pandemic, and there's all the sustainability agenda with COP26 that's just concluded here in Glasgow. But obviously the best time to plant a tree was probably 20, 30 years ago. The second best time is now. So using that analogy, what one piece of advice would you leave the audience with today in terms of trying to create their own sustainable businesses going forward? What would be your nugget for them to take away? Josh, I'm going to come to you first.
Rami, do you have one? If you can go.
Mine would have been very simple, I guess, pragmatic. Do you want mine first? Like, it's very short.
Yeah,
but it's what I honestly, it's what I tell myself every day, getting up, like, you know, one foot in front of the other. You know, like this is, it's like the accusation of COP26 being a PR exercise is because there's a lot of talking, there's a lot of really big picture thinking, which is important, but ultimately the change is going to come from people who are steadily putting one foot in front of the other. And if you can do that, like, you know, just like it's about having the big conversation and then being able to radically breaking it down into the feasible tasks ahead. Because the big conversations can get very discouraging very quickly, right? Like if you stay at that like 30,000 feet level, it's just, so that would be my advice. Like, you know, break it down, make yourself feel that it, like you're successful at making progress, and that will keep you motivated for many years to come.
Yeah, fantastic. And Josh, you're going to agree, I know, but I need a different answer from you.
Yeah, I think we kind of hit on this point, but, you know, I really like this idea of not romanticizing what's in the family business, but also realizing the potential that's out there. And, you know, like I said, it's not going to be easy, and in most good things in life aren't. And, you know, when family businesses go wrong, they go really wrong. And that's why the stories we tell about family businesses in the media, except other than FBU and Tharawat and the equivalent, are all the negative stories. They're the Successions and the equivalent. They make for great dramas, but when it goes well, it can be just so fulfilling on so many different levels. And so I guess my advice is to understand that it's going to be challenging. Don't take the romantic view. Don't also take the popular view that it's a hotbed of conflict and it's destined to fail and all those things. And realize that you know, sometimes it's just not the right thing for you, but if it is, it can be truly a wonderful environment, you know, successful in many different versions and variations of success. And in those situations, I think it's worth the trouble.
Josh, that's brilliant. I just like to add, in terms of just honest just make sure you have honest conversations, be true to who you are as an individual, because if you're not fulfilled individually, you're going to find it really hard to find fulfillment doing something that you don't feel is right for you. Find your own why would be for me. Just find your own why and do what makes you happy, because life is too short. Ramia, Josh, as always, I could talk to you all day. You know I could. It's a delight to talk to you both. I love just your passion, your wisdom, your ideas, your thoughts. It's food for thought for all of us, and it's been a great way to end the summit for me this year. So, guys, thank you so much for all your time this afternoon. Thank you for contributing to a great conversation, and we look forward to catching up with you very soon.
Thanks, Paul, for a great summit. It was super interesting. Thank you so much.
Same here. Thank you both.
Take care.